We'd been planning my son's 12th birthday for weeks. Little things that pile up into a night that feels important. Inflatable stars strung through the oak, paper lanterns for the picnic tables, a cooler so full of soda it threatened to burst. We live out on a wide plot of land in southern New Jersey. Our yard backs onto a narrow ribbon of mixed hardwoods and pine that the kids have always treated like an extension of the playground. For years, that tree line was nothing more than a place to launch firecrackers or dare someone to race to the big oak and back. That night, it was supposed to be a backyard party. Family, a few neighbors, my brother Dom and his kids, my wife's aunt with her famous deviled eggs, and the boys, half a dozen of them, who knew all the secret hiding spots at the edge of the woods. The sun slid down late for a summer's evening, and the mosquitoes came like a rolling cloud, hungry and persistent. I ran to the metal shed to grab tiki torches, 6 of them, cheap bamboo poles with little fuel cans, but they gave off a warm cone of light that felt as if it could hold the dark at bay. I jammed them into the ground along the border of the yard, their flames shivering in the breeze and filling the night with the faint smell of citronella. We gathered around the tables. Kids ran barefoot over dewy grass. Cousins swapped jokes, and older folks traded the kind of gossip that only families dare to call news. At first, the noise of the kids bouncing around muffled any small anxiety. They wanted to play hide and seek the way kids do when dusk turns the trees into an invitation. My son and 5 of his buddies begged to be allowed into the tree line for a quick round. I remember glancing at my wife, shrugging, then saying what every parent says in that hazy dusk. Stay close to the tree line. If anyone yells, come back right away. We had the glow of the torches and cell phones on pockets, practical precautions that felt like enough. 15 minutes passed. Laughter bled through the thin veil of trees. Squeals, the stomp of running feet, scooters colliding with sticks. And I relaxed. The adults settled into that soft talk that comes with good food and light wine. Then, in a single wrong chord, the laughter shredded into screams. Not the high, jagged volume of a skinned knee or a lost shoe, but a piercing sound that folded the night in on itself. It was a raw animal scream, something between a human shriek and the keening of a wounded animal. It didn't sound like any child. Heads snapped up. Paper cups clattered to the grass. For a heartbeat, we all just looked at each other, as if a silent agreement could turn noise back into normal. Then the kids came out of the trees, one after another, faces pale and eyes huge, breath ragged. They shouted things that made no sense at first words, stitched with panic. There's something in there, eyes watching. Don't go. My son's hair was drenched with sweat, his shirt smeared with mud. They were trembling and talking over one another, pointing back toward the saplings. They described a sound, and then a figure, something moving between trunks, watching, making a low clucking or moan that they said made the hairs on their arms stand up. We didn't have black bears or coyotes frequenting this patch of Mercer County. Whatever they heard and saw didn't fit the animal noises I knew. My brother Dom and I volunteered to go in. We grabbed flashlights, big, old metal mag lights, and pushed into the dark, where the torchlight thinned and moonlight folded into shadows. The woods closed in quick, the path narrowing to a wagon track more than a trail. At first it was only insects and the rustle of leaves, But then something changed. A sound that could have been the wind, or could have been breathing that didn't belong to a deer or a raccoon. We moved toward that sound, each step measured. My light sliced through undergrowth and fell across trunks daubed with moss. At one point I stopped. Dom's hand landed on my arm, small and urgent. He was watching something to my left, an area where the canopy pressed low and the underbrush had been flattened like a palm. For a moment, I thought it might be an abandoned tent or a tarp. My brain wanted it to be a lawn chair or a sleeping teenager playing a prank. Then we heard it soft at first, a wet, low moan that crept up from behind a stand of saplings. It wasn't the sharp bark of a fox or the lonely call of an owl. It was a long, slow sound that could have been a person in pain or some creature imitating pain. As we raised our lights, we saw movement. Not a tidy human silhouette, but something that shifted wrong. Shoulders too narrow, a torso bent at a strange angle, a hand that moved with too many joints. It was close to the ground, almost crawling. And when it turned toward us, the light caught on eyes that reflected silver, not with the innocent shine of deer, but with a cold, patient gleam. Dom let out a word, and the thing let out a noise that was half a laugh and half a growl. The hairs on the back of my neck pricked. I reached instinctively toward the radio in my pocket to call for help, but before I could, the figure recoiled and melted deeper into the trees, like a shadow realizing it had been discovered. The moaning stopped. The woods went eerily quiet, too quiet, like the world was holding its breath. We retreated, not slow, not cautious. We cut straight back to the open lawn, the torches looking suddenly thin and childish in the dark. Once we were out, the kids huddled close to the patio where the adults had gathered, each of them babbling the same thing in a chorus of fear. It watched us. It made noises. It followed. We called the sheriff's department. Dom and I tried to describe the thing to the woman on the other end, but words stuck. She suggested a wild animal, said officers would check the property when they could, and advised we keep the kids inside until they arrived. We argued that it felt like a person, that the noise had cadence and intent, that the way it moved wasn't right for any animal we knew. She said dispatch would treat it like an animal call unless we could provide evidence. Later, sitting by a table of half-finished plates, with torches guttering and kids wrapped in blankets, I replayed what I'd seen and the sound of that moan. It didn't belong to the woods I thought I knew. It was deliberate, and it felt hungry in a way that made the hair along my arms rise to attention. We split up into small parties. The sensible ones stayed with the children under the tiki torches, while Dom and I took the deeper tracks with two other neighbors who'd come out when they heard the screaming. Everyone had a flashlight. Someone handed me a cheap LED that made a sharp cone of light and turned the trees into tall charcoal sketches. The sky was clear, a hard, indifferent black. The torches made a fragile ring of safety behind us like a child's drawing of a fort. We moved slower this time, each footfall deliberate. Voices clipped low so we wouldn't call anything toward us. Dom kept a hand on his radio like a talisman. Every so often he clicked it and hissed a description into it, trying to be clinical while the words rattled. Male, adult voice, maybe, no, not human, he said once, voice breaking on the last part. The neighbor Pete swore under his breath that he'd heard every kind of animal call in 20 years out there, and this wasn't any of them. It had rhythm, he said, like someone trying to speak through a throat full of gravel. We found the first signs before the second circle of torches, flattened grass, as if someone, or something, had been sitting there watching the party through boughs. That could have been a teenager playing a prank. But then we saw the tracks. Not quite footprints, not quite paw prints. They were long and narrow, 3 indented marks in a row where the toes would be, and an elongated heel like a canoe paddle pressed into wet earth. The mud between the trees took the shape cleanly. Our flashlight beams made them shine wet and wrong. "Not a deer," Pete muttered. "Not a raccoon, not a coyote." He sounded like a man trying to read a language he'd never learned. We photographed the prints with our phones. Shaky thumbnails that later, when you zoomed, looked stranger and stranger. Impressions that hinted at a jointed limb. The negative space between the 3 divots too angular to be natural. We pressed on. The moaning had been gone for a while. The woods were merely a bed of insect noise and the rustle of leaves. Then something moved ahead of us. A small rustling that resolved into a metallic glint. A strip of aluminum, maybe, snagged on a branch. My beam landed on it and then moved. Red spray paint streaked along the bark of 3 trees. 2 crude X's over and over, sloppy and fresh. The smell of the paint was sharp and chemical in the night air. Whoever marked those trees had been mapping or signaling or leaving a trail. The X's made me think of maps and traps, of children's treasure hunts turned sour. We called to each other and backtracked, trying to match the prints to the paint, making a line between the evidence like a flawed connect the dots. The kids huddled under the nearest torch, faces blown pale by the flame light, clutching one another. My son's lower lip trembled. He wouldn't meet my eyes. "It was right there," he kept saying. "It looked at me, and then it went click, like a camera." The word made no sense, but the way he said it made our skin crawl. When the sheriff's SUV finally rolled up, once someone had phoned it in, once neighbors had turned on lights and phones and made noise, we watched blue beacons touch the tree line and push the darkness back. 2 deputies jumped out with flashlights and a dog on a short leash. The canine nosed at the ground and gave a small, puzzled yip, then pushed forward with his nose low. He didn't bark to chase. The handler frowned and said the dog's behavior was odd. Normally, the hound would point to a well-defined scent and hold there, but tonight he darted low and then frisked at the X marks as if the scent itself confused him. We explained what the kids had said, showed them the tracks and the painted trees, and someone from dispatch said they'd call wildlife control and send a unit to canvass the area. The deputies flashed their lights into the thicker brush, the beams cutting through the trunks in rectangles of white. Silence answered the light. No breathy exhale, no twig snapping. As the night aged, the calls to check the perimeter became routine. The deputies walked the property in relays, shining lights, walking paths, calling out. Every time they passed the place where the kids had first screamed, the hair on my arms lifted. Twice we thought we heard something, a cough that might have been a throat, a twig snap that might have been a heel, and both times we swung our lights there only to find empty air. The tech on my phone showed the photos of the prints and the paint. When we zoomed, they looked worse, cramped and alien, like a child's drawing of a monster realized in dirt. At one point, someone shouted, a tiny animal had been caught in a neighbor's motion sensor light, and for a second relief brightened the circle. It was only a raccoon, scolding and clawing at the metal trash bin. Laughter came out of us like a pressure release. The mood cracked, and for a minute we let ourselves breathe. But the laughter didn't reach my chest. It was a false scare in reverse, the way horror movies trick you into feeling safe in the face of the ridiculous. Then, as the deputies were about to leave a perimeter watch in place until sunrise, we heard it again. That moist, twisting moan, closer now, threaded with something like breathing, and the faint, irregular click the kids had mimicked. The sound came from deeper in the woods but threaded down toward the torches like a fishing line. Heads turned. Flashlights swung. For the first time since the children had run out, the sound felt intentional, not a byproduct of nature but a message, practiced and patient. We didn't see anything move. We only felt watched, the old, cold certainty of being the thing someone else had been waiting for. The deputies tightened their circle, radios bright with static, and the dog gave one low, unhappy growl. Whoever, or whatever made that noise, knew the rhythm of our fear. The night had stopped being just strange. It had decided it wanted to be remembered. We kept watch until the sky showed a thin smear of gray and the torches guttered into orange stubs. Deputies rotated through, radios crackling, dog handlers swapping notes with dispatch, and finally a wildlife officer showed up with a pickup full of traps and gear. He moved differently from the deputies' theatrical light, more methodical. He took one look at the X's painted on the trees and the strange prints, and his mouth tightened. We'll set a few trail cams and leave traps, he said. But if this is some human prank, they'll have cameras on them. If it's an animal, well, it's not a normal one. He did not say what not normal meant, only that he'd seen odd stuff in 40 years, and this fit none of the usual boxes. They left a deputy at the house for the night, and my brother and I took turns pacing the lawn between the torches, the beam of our flashlights making the woods look like the teeth of some great dark thing. Every weathered trunk was a possible hide, every pile of leaves a crouched watcher. The kids slept with flashlights under their pillows, and my wife didn't let our son out of her sight for days. We drew a line around the tree line with rope and told the boys they were forbidden to cross it without grown-ups. That night, sleep was a flimsy ghost. I sat on the back steps and watched the woods breathe, feeling watched in return. When daylight came, the evidence looked smaller, somehow less dramatic, but no less unsettling. The prints were still there in the mud, long grooves in the three-toed crescents that refused to fit any field guide. The X's on the trees had dried into crusted, bright red scars against the bark. A neighbor who worked at the university said the paint looked like a contractor's spray, the kind you mark out for demolition. But why tag your own woods with demolition marks? And why that chant-like rhythm the kids had described, X marks the spot? That now seemed a touch too organized to be random graffiti. Over the next week, the sheriff's office brought in additional manpower to canvass nearby properties. They interviewed neighbors who kept yards facing the same sapling thicket, One woman said she'd often walk her dog late and had sometimes felt a pressure against the edge of the woods, like a presence leaning in. Another neighbor had set up a motion-activated camera overnight and caught a series of frames that, at first glance, showed nothing. At closer zoom, though, one frame froze a smudge of lighter color between two trunks, an elongation of form that blurred into shadow when the frames on either side were compared. It wasn't proof. It was enough to make the investigator frown. Life tried to reassert itself. School started again, and the boys were coaxed back into normal play, though they refused to go into the wood alone. They made forts in the yard now under watch. We installed extra lights along the perimeter and strung bright bulbs through the lower limbs so the edges glowed like a fence of constellations. My son slept with the bedroom door open and a small LED lamp on his nightstand, the cone of light thin but defiant. For a while that worked. For a while the house returned to being a house and not a fortress. But after a month, something smaller and stranger crept in. The way our conversation bent toward the woods. We stopped planning evenings that skirted the tree line. Barbecues moved center field. The kids stopped daring one another to sprint to the big oak. The woods had been downgraded from playground to potential hazard. A ritual had been rewritten. No more dares, no more sneaking out of sight. And then, 6 months later, someone spray-painted an X on the mailbox at the end of my driveway. It wasn't fresh paint. It had the same faded red tone as the tree scars after weather took its edge. I found it one late afternoon when I stepped out to get the paper. The mark was almost playful in its placement, right there, where anyone leaving or arriving would see it. When I touched it, the paint flaked cold against my fingers, as if seasoned by months of sun and rain. I took a photograph and sent it to the deputy who'd been on rotation that night. He came by within an hour, radioed it in, and said they'd up patrols for the next few weeks. He didn't say the thing that tightened my chest. Someone had returned to make the message visible where no one could ignore it. There were theories among neighbors. Teenagers playing at being spooky. A ritual left by some group we didn't want to be part of. A lover's quarrel turned performance art. The more people talked, the more the explanation frayed. A few older residents muttered about old habits around those woods. Odd rituals, hunters marking paths. But their faces when they said it turned resigned, like they'd handed a key to a door, and nobody wanted to open it. The last time I walked the property at dusk, I stayed well within the torches. Light. I took a small camera and filmed the edge, recording every faint bird call and the scratch of a squirrel. When I got home and looked through the footage that night, my stomach dropped. There, between two frames, just at the corner of torchlight, something moved with a speed that suggested elbows and knees bent in the wrong places. It was a blink of motion, a flicker too fast to be human, too deliberate to be a trick of wind. I froze the image and blew it up. The pixels refused to cooperate. A smear resolved into a suggestion, a pale hand elongated, as if the fingers had extra length. Not definitive, not prosecutable, but enough to reopen that old tender crease of fear. I don't know if it was something human. I don't know if it was something else. I know only what we felt. The long, patient attention of something that had marked our trees and practiced a sound to unnerved children. I know the way my son's laugh changed after that summer, the way he watches the tree line when we drive past, like someone counting possible exits in the dark. I know that there are things that make no sense and refuse to be hammered into explanation. People told us to move on. You lived, they said. You got lucky. They were right, in the most obvious sense. We were lucky in that we had a sheriff's department that cared enough to walk the woods and neighbors who helped search. But luck didn't scrub away the residue. The alarmed phone calls at night, the idea that something had chosen our yard to test its patience. And sometimes, when the night has been long and quiet, I still step outside and stand just inside the ring of torches. I watch the tree line press black against the sky. I listen for the rustle that isn't quite wind. The woods seem to hum, as if something in them is amused that we live our lives with the knowledge of being observed. The boys have grown a little since that summer, taller and bolder, but when one of them asks to cross the torches after dark, I don't say yes. There is a small, practical part of me that wants evidence-clear frames, a footprint that fits a boot, a confession in a bar. There is another part, older and quieter, that understands that not everything can be boxed and labeled. Some things are better given distance, and some things are better watched. We learn to keep our lights up. We learn to be louder than we used to be. We learn that a backyard is not merely grass and a shed, but a border that can be watched, and sometimes better left untested. If there is a final lesson from that night, it is blunt and boring. Respect the edge. Trees keep counsel with things we don't see. Children's games are vulnerable. When something in the dark decides to watch, it does so slowly, patiently, and with choices in mind. We were lucky to have walked away. The woods still wait. And sometimes, late in the evening when the lights are low and the insects sing, I swear I can hear a soft, low note from the tree line. Less a howl than a chuckle like. Something that has learned the taste of small, startled humans and is content to wait for the next round.